The alien ship descended upon the quiet Earth colony, a small dot in the vast galaxy. Its sleek, metallic body shimmered in the sunlight as it hovered above the ground, casting a wide shadow over the village. The people looked up, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. These weren't the first visitors from the stars, but this arrival carried a sense of foreboding. They had seen the destruction that followed such ships before. The blacksmith wiped the sweat from his brow, barely glancing at the vessel. His hands continued working on a plow, hammering the metal with practiced precision. The clanging sound of steel on steel echoed through the village, a steady rhythm that contrasted with the tension filling the air. He had no interest in the show of force the aliens were about to display. The doors of the ship slid open, and a group of towering figures emerged. Their armor gleamed, and their eyes scanned the humans with disdain. At their head was a general, his posture rigid with arrogance. He stepped forward, his voice booming across the village. "Earth, a forgotten relic of a lost species. You should feel honored that we even bother with you now." His eyes narrowed as he looked at the villagers, clearly unimpressed. A few of the locals murmured among themselves, but most stayed silent, unwilling to provoke the alien leaders. The blacksmith continued working, unfazed by the spectacle. His focus remained on the metal, shaping it into the tool it needed to be. The general noticed this and, with a sneer, gestured toward him. "What's this? A primitive working on toys while we stand here?" The blacksmith didn't look up. "I'm just doing my job," he said calmly, his voice low but steady. The general scoffed, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Your job? What a joke. Your kind was crushed in the wars centuries ago. You should know your place." The villagers shifted uncomfortably. They knew better than to argue with the alien forces. But the blacksmith remained calm, hammering away at the plow without a word. The general, irritated by the lack of response, stepped closer. "Do you even understand who you're speaking to, human?" "I understand perfectly," the blacksmith replied, still not lifting his eyes from his work. The general's patience wore thin. "I could have you and your entire village wiped out with a single command," he threatened, stepping closer, his voice cold and dangerous. The blacksmith finally looked up, his eyes meeting the general's. There was no fear, no anger, just a quiet intensity. "And what would that prove? That you're stronger than a man working a forge?" The general's lips twitched in frustration. "You're not even worth the effort. Your planet, your people, they're irrelevant." One of the alien soldiers chuckled, stepping forward with a sneer. "Let's show them how irrelevant they are." He raised a weapon, aiming it at a nearby building. The villagers gasped, backing away in fear, but the blacksmith didn't move. "Wait." The general held up a hand, stopping the soldier. His eyes lingered on the blacksmith, curiosity flickering beneath his disdain. "You claim to be a blacksmith, yes? A maker of weapons?" "I make what's needed," the blacksmith said, his tone neutral. The general grinned, an idea forming in his mind. "Then prove it. Forge something that could stand against our might. Show us what Earth has left to offer." The blacksmith stood, wiping his hands on his apron. "If that's what you want." He turned and walked back to his forge, unbothered by the alien soldiers watching him. The villagers whispered nervously, unsure of what was about to happen. They had seen the blacksmith's work over the years, but they didn't know what he could possibly do to stand up to the aliens. He wasn't a warrior, after all. Just a man who shaped metal. Hours passed as the blacksmith worked. The aliens grew restless, their sneers and laughter filling the air. They weren't concerned. To them, this was just a game, a way to humiliate the humans further. But the blacksmith didn't hurry. He moved with purpose, every strike of his hammer deliberate, every piece of metal crafted with precision. Finally, as the sun began to set, the blacksmith stepped out of his forge. In his hands was a weapon unlike any the aliens had ever seen. It was simple in design, but there was something about it, something dangerous. The general raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That's it." The blacksmith nodded, holding the weapon out. "This is what you wanted." The general chuckled, motioning to one of his soldiers. Go on, test it. Show this human what real power looks like. The alien soldier stepped forward, his weapon drawn, confident in his victory. But as soon as he lunged, the blacksmith moved with a speed and precision that none of them expected. The weapon flashed, and in a matter of seconds, the alien soldier was on the ground, defeated. The villagers gasped in shock, but the blacksmith remained calm, his expression unchanged. He lowered the weapon, looking at the general. Is that enough? The general's amusement faded, replaced by a flicker of doubt. You got lucky, he growled, but his voice lacked the same confidence as before. The blacksmith shrugged. Maybe. Without another word, he turned back to his forge, leaving the alien standing there, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The blacksmith returned to his forge, his focus as sharp as the blade he had just used. The alien soldiers were still reeling from the shock, murmuring among themselves. They couldn't understand how a mere human had taken down one of their elite. But the blacksmith didn't care about their confusion. His only concern was his craft. Inside the forge, he inspected the blade, wiping it clean of the soldier's blood. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a tool, something created with purpose. Each part of it had been carefully considered, from the balance of the hilt to the sharpness of the edge. It was simple, effective, and deadly. Outside, the general's patience was wearing thin. His confidence, once unshakable, had taken a hit. He couldn't admit it, but the blacksmith had rattled him. The soldier he had lost was one of his best, trained in the most advanced forms of combat. Yet he had fallen in seconds to a human with a piece of forged metal. The general's ego wouldn't allow him to leave it at that. You've made your point. The general called out to the blacksmith, his voice laced with irritation. But one lucky strike doesn't prove anything. You were clever, I'll give you that. But you won't survive a real fight. The blacksmith emerged from the forge, calm and unbothered. Is that what you're offering? He asked, his tone steady. The general sneered. I'm offering you a chance to face real power. No tricks, no games. Just you against the best warriors the galaxy has to offer. The blacksmith studied the general's face for a moment, then nodded. If that's what you want. The general wasted no time. He signaled to his remaining soldiers, who stepped forward, weapons drawn. They were the elite, hand-picked for their strength, speed, and skill. These weren't the average foot soldiers that had mocked the blacksmith earlier. These were killers, trained to conquer entire planets. The villagers watched in silence, fear gripping them. They knew the blacksmith had skill, but this was different. These aliens weren't to be trifled with. The blacksmith, however, remained calm. He didn't posture or prepare for a grand fight. Instead, he walked forward, his weapon resting lightly in his hand. The first alien struck with the speed of a viper, his blade slicing through the air with deadly intent. But the blacksmith moved even faster, stepping aside at the last second and countering with a swift, precise blow. The alien dropped to the ground, defeated in an instant. The second alien didn't hesitate. He lunged at the blacksmith, swinging a heavy, advanced weapon designed to crush armor and bone. But the blacksmith didn't flinch. He dodged with ease, using his smaller, lighter weapon to cut through the alien's defenses. A few quick strikes, and the second alien fell. The third soldier hesitated. He had seen his comrades fall, and doubt was creeping into his mind. The blacksmith's movements were too smooth, too calculated. He wasn't just a blacksmith, he was something else, something more dangerous than they had anticipated. The blacksmith gave the third soldier a chance to back down, but pride wouldn't let him. The alien roared in anger and charged, but the fight was over before it even began. With a single, fluid motion, the blacksmith disarmed the soldier and left him crumpled on the ground. The general watched in disbelief. 3 of his best warriors, all taken down by a human who was supposed to be beneath him. His soldiers lay on the ground, defeated, while the blacksmith stood before him, calm and composed, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. This isn't possible, the general muttered under his breath, his arrogance cracking. He stepped forward, fury boiling inside him. You're not just a blacksmith. The blacksmith looked at him, his expression unchanged. I never said I was just a blacksmith. The general clenched his fists, rage overtaking him. Who are you then? Some kind of soldier? A spy? I'm just a man who knows how to survive, the blacksmith replied simply. The general's eyes burned with anger. Enough of this. I'll crush you myself if I have to. He drew his own weapon, a massive, high-tech blade that buzzed with energy. The general was no stranger to combat. He had led countless battles across the galaxy, conquering worlds and crushing resistance with ease. But this was different. For the first time in a long while, he felt the sting of uncertainty. The blacksmith didn't react to the threat. He stood still, his weapon held loosely at his side. The general charged, swinging his blade with all the force of his alien strength. But the blacksmith moved with the same calm precision as before, dodging each attack with ease. Their battle raged on, the general growing more frustrated with each missed strike. His attacks were powerful, but they lacked the finesse that the blacksmith possessed. It wasn't long before the blacksmith found an opening. With a quick, decisive movement, he disarmed the general, sending his weapon clattering to the ground. The general stumbled back, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with shock. He had never been bested like this before. He couldn't understand how a human, someone he had deemed weak and insignificant, had managed to defeat him. The blacksmith lowered his weapon, showing no sign of victory or triumph. I don't want to kill you, he said, his voice calm but firm. But I will if I have to. The general glared at him, his pride wounded beyond repair. This isn't over, he growled, his voice shaking with rage. He turned and stormed back to his ship, his soldiers scrambling to follow him. The blacksmith watched them go, his face unreadable. The villagers slowly gathered around the blacksmith, their fear turning to awe. They had witnessed something they couldn't fully comprehend. The quiet man who had lived among them for years was no ordinary blacksmith. He was something far more dangerous, far more skilled than they had ever realized. But the blacksmith didn't bask in their admiration. He simply returned to his forge, wiping the sweat from his brow and getting back to work. To him, the battle was over. The aliens had made their move, and he had responded. Now, it was time to return to what he knew best. The alien general sat in his ship, seething in silence. His defeat at the hands of a human, a mere blacksmith, no less, gnawed at his pride. He had led armies, conquered planets, crushed civilizations, but now he had been humiliated in front of his own men by someone he considered beneath him. It wasn't something he could let go easily. No, he would make sure the blacksmith paid for this insult. Prepare the elites, he ordered, his voice cold and sharp. The remaining soldiers, who had witnessed their comrades fall, hesitated for a moment. The elites were reserved for the most dangerous missions, and deploying them against a single human seemed almost absurd. But they obeyed without question. The general wasn't taking any more chances. He wouldn't just overpower the blacksmith, he would utterly annihilate him. No mistakes this time, no underestimating the human's abilities. The elites were the finest warriors in the galaxy, trained to take down any threat, no matter how skilled. They wouldn't fall like the others. Back in the village, the blacksmith continued his work, undisturbed by the impending attack. The forge was alive with the heat of the fire, the sound of his hammer echoing through the still air. He knew the general wasn't done with him. He could feel the tension, the weight of the coming battle. But he didn't worry. He had faced worse before. The villagers, though, were growing more nervous. They had seen the blacksmith defeat the alien soldiers, but now they feared the retaliation that would surely come. They whispered among themselves, wondering if their village would survive the next assault. The blacksmith wasn't concerned. His mind was clear, his focus unshaken. He knew what was coming, but he also knew how to prepare. There was no need for panic, no need for fear. He had faced impossible odds before, and he had always survived. The elites arrived in the dead of night, their black armor blending into the darkness. They moved with precision, silent and deadly, surrounding the village with military efficiency. These weren't soldiers who relied on brute strength alone. They were strategists, tacticians, each one capable of killing without hesitation. The blacksmith could hear them before he saw them. The quiet rustle of armor, the faint hum of advanced weapons. They were good, better than the others, but he was ready. He stepped out of his forge, weapon in hand, his eyes scanning the shadows. The elites were invisible to the untrained eye, but not to him. They struck without warning, moving as one, their attacks coordinated and swift. But the blacksmith moved faster. His weapon flashed in the moonlight, cutting through the darkness with deadly precision. The elites, despite their training, were caught off guard. They had expected resistance, but not at this level. The blacksmith fought with a calm intensity, his movements smooth and deliberate. Each strike was measured, each defense perfectly timed. The elites, who had never faced a human like this, found themselves struggling to keep up. One by one they fell, their advanced armor and weapons useless against the blacksmith's skill. The battle was brutal and quick, the elites falling as swiftly as they had attacked. The villagers, who had been watching from their homes, couldn't believe what they were seeing. The blacksmith, their quiet neighbor, had just taken down the most feared warriors in the galaxy without breaking a sweat. But the blacksmith didn't stop to celebrate. He knew this was only the beginning. The general wouldn't let this go. There would be more soldiers, more battles, and he would have to be ready. The general watched from his ship, fury burning in his chest. The elites, his most trusted warriors, had been defeated as easily as the others. This was no longer about proving a point. It was personal now. The blacksmith had made a fool of him, and the general would see him dead, no matter the cost. He barked orders at his crew, preparing for an all-out assault. He would bring the full force of his army down on the blacksmith, wipe the village off the map, and ensure that no one ever questioned his power again. He wouldn't leave anything to chance. The blacksmith returned to his forge, knowing that the next attack would be different. The general was coming for him personally this time, and he would bring everything he had. But the blacksmith wasn't afraid. He had faced enemies like this before, and he knew how they thought. The general's pride was his weakness, and the blacksmith would use it against him. As the hours passed, the villagers grew more anxious. They had seen the blacksmith's strength, but they also knew the general wouldn't stop until he had his revenge. Some wanted to flee, to leave before the real battle began. But the blacksmith stood firm, his calm presence a beacon in the chaos. He told them to stay, to trust him. He had a plan. The general's army descended on the village at dawn, their ships blotting out the sky. The ground trembled under the weight of their landing, the air thick with the sound of engines and weapons powering up. It was an overwhelming display of force, designed to crush any remaining resistance. But the blacksmith was ready. He had prepared traps throughout the village, using his knowledge of metal and craftsmanship to turn the terrain to his advantage. As the soldiers marched forward, they found themselves caught in a web of hidden dangers, explosives disguised as simple tools, razor-sharp wires stretched between buildings, and weapons crafted from the very materials the blacksmith had worked with for years. The soldiers faltered, their advance slowing as they realized they were walking into a death trap. The blacksmith moved through the chaos like a ghost, his weapon flashing in the dim light as he took out the soldiers one by one. He didn't need an army or advanced technology. His mind, his skill, and his craft were all he needed. The general, watching from the command center of his ship, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His army, his unstoppable force, was being decimated by a single man. The blacksmith was everywhere, and the soldiers couldn't keep up. It was as if he had planned for every possible scenario, every move they made. Finally, the general had enough. This wasn't a battle anymore, it was an embarrassment. He slammed his fist down on the control panel, ordering the remaining forces to pull back. If his soldiers couldn't defeat the blacksmith, then he would do it himself. The general stepped down from his ship, rage fueling every step. His once pristine uniform was now a symbol of his growing frustration. He had sent wave after wave of his best soldiers, and each time, the blacksmith had defeated them with an ease that seemed almost casual. This was no longer about conquest. This was about reclaiming his pride. The village lay in ruins around him, the remnants of his army scattered in the dust, and the man who had caused it all stood waiting. The blacksmith watched the general approach, his weapon resting in his hand, his face calm and unreadable. He wasn't surprised. He had known the general would eventually face him directly. This was how it always went with men like him, men who let their pride guide their decisions. The general wasn't here for victory. He was here to prove a point, and that made him vulnerable. "You've humiliated me for the last time." The general spat, his voice dripping with venom. "No more games. No more tricks. This ends now." The blacksmith didn't respond. He simply nodded, acknowledging the challenge. He had no desire to draw this out. It was time to end it, and he knew that the general's fury would be his downfall. The general attacked first, his blade humming with energy, swinging with all the power his advanced armor could muster. But the blacksmith was quicker, stepping aside with a practiced ease that spoke of years of experience. The general's swings were wide, driven by anger, lacking the precision of a trained warrior. The blacksmith, on the other hand, moved with calculated grace, conserving his energy, waiting for the right moment. The clash of their weapons rang out across the empty village, the general's frustration growing with each missed strike. He was used to overpowering his enemies, overwhelming them with sheer force. But the blacksmith wasn't playing by those rules. He wasn't trying to match the general's strength, he was using the general's aggression against him, turning each wild swing into an opportunity. The general snarled, his face twisting in fury. "Stand still and fight me like a warrior!" he roared, his patience wearing thin. "I am fighting," the blacksmith replied calmly, dodging another wild attack. Each time the general lunged, the blacksmith stepped aside, striking only when necessary. His hits weren't meant to kill immediately. They were meant to weaken, to slow the general down. A cut here, a slash there, each one calculated to sap the general's strength bit by bit. The general's breathing grew labored, his attacks more desperate as he realized what was happening. The blacksmith was dismantling him, piece by piece, with no wasted effort. For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed the general's face. He had never faced an opponent like this, someone who fought with such deliberate control. His anger, once a source of power, was now his greatest weakness. Every emotion-fueled attack only pushed him closer to defeat. The blacksmith could see it, the moment when the general's arrogance faltered. That brief flicker of doubt, the realization that he was losing control. It was all the blacksmith needed. He moved in quickly, his weapon flashing in the fading light, disarming the general with a fluid motion. The general staggered back, his weapon clattering to the ground, his eyes wide with disbelief. The blacksmith didn't gloat, didn't make a speech. He simply stood there, his weapon at the ready, waiting for the general to make his next move. There was no need for words. The outcome was clear. The general, gasping for breath, glared at the blacksmith, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. You're just a human," he spat, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it true, would somehow diminish the blacksmith's victory. The blacksmith tilted his head slightly, considering the words. "I am," he said simply. The general's eyes darted around, searching for any way out, any way to turn the tide in his favor. But there was none. His army was gone, his weapons useless, and the blacksmith stood before him, unshaken, unbroken. There was nothing left. "You've lost," the blacksmith said quietly, the statement a simple fact, not a taunt. The general's shoulders sagged, the weight of his defeat finally settling on him. He had come to Earth expecting to crush the remnants of a forgotten race, to prove his superiority once and for all. Instead, he had been brought low by a single man, a blacksmith who had shown him the true meaning of strength. His ego, once his greatest asset, had been his undoing. The blacksmith lowered his weapon, showing mercy, though it was clear the general didn't deserve it. "Go," he said, his voice steady. "Take what's left of your army and leave." The general's eyes flashed with anger, but he knew there was no point in continuing. He had been defeated, not just physically but mentally as well. His soldiers wouldn't follow him after this, and he had no desire to face the blacksmith again. With a final growl of frustration, he turned and limped back toward his ship, his pride in tatters. The villagers, who had been watching from the safety of their homes, slowly emerged, unsure of what to do. They had witnessed the impossible. A single man had stood against an alien army and won. The blacksmith, their quiet, unassuming neighbor, had revealed himself as something far greater than they had ever imagined. But the blacksmith didn't seek their admiration. He didn't bask in the glory of his victory. Instead, he returned to his forge, wiping the sweat from his brow, and set about repairing the damage done to his tools. To him, the battle was over, and life would return to normal. There was no need for celebration. The villagers watched in awe, but the blacksmith remained the same man they had always known. He had no desire for fame or recognition. His only goal had been to protect his home, to do what was necessary when the time came. And now that it was done, he was content to return to the life he had always known. As the alien ship lifted off, disappearing into the sky, the village slowly returned to its quiet routine. The people whispered about what had happened, about the blacksmith's incredible skill, but they knew better than to ask him about it. He wasn't a man who sought attention. He was simply a man who did what had to be done. The galaxy, however, would not forget this day. Stories would spread about the blacksmith of Earth, the man who had faced an alien army and won. But the blacksmith himself? He would remain unknown, his legend growing quietly in the shadows, just as he preferred it. As the alien ship disappeared beyond the clouds, the village breathed a collective sigh of relief. The threat was over. Or so it seemed. The blacksmith wiped his hands and returned to his forge, but something in the air had changed. The villagers were silent, watching him closely now, their respect tinged with a hint of something else, fear. A few days passed in uneasy peace. The blacksmith went about his work, as always, hammering and crafting, though the quiet whispers among the villagers grew louder. They marveled at his skill, but there were questions that no one dared ask aloud. Where had he learned to fight like that? How could a simple blacksmith possess such deadly power? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a shadow fell over the forge. The blacksmith looked up to find a young boy from the village standing in the doorway. His eyes were wide, filled with curiosity and something darker, mistrust. "I heard them talking," the boy began, shifting nervously. "They say you're not really one of us. That you're different." The blacksmith put down his tools, his expression calm, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "What do you mean, different? They say you came to the village years ago, but no one knows where from. You're not like the rest of us. You don't age. You don't change. It's like you're not even human." For a moment, the blacksmith said nothing. The hammer in his hand felt heavier than usual. The truth he had buried for so long was threatening to surface. The villagers had always seen him as one of their own, but now that they had witnessed his abilities, the cracks in his story were starting to show. The boy took a step closer, his voice barely a whisper. Are you even from Earth?" The blacksmith's gaze turned distant. He had always known this day would come, but he had hoped to delay it. He turned back to the forge, not answering right away, as if deciding whether to share a truth long kept hidden. "I was born on Earth," he said finally, his voice low. "But the man I am now, that's a different story." The boy's eyes widened, fear creeping into his voice. "What do you mean?" The blacksmith sighed, the weight of his past finally catching up with him. "A long time ago, before the wars, before the aliens came, I was part of a secret program. Earth knew the day would come when we would face threats beyond our world. They needed someone, something, to stand against that threat. I wasn't always a blacksmith." The boy took another step back, the truth sinking in. "You were created?" "I was enhanced," the blacksmith corrected, though the word didn't soften the blow. "Genetically altered, trained, and conditioned to be the perfect soldier. But after the wars, I left that life behind. I came here, to this village, to live quietly, to be something other than a weapon. The boy looked at him, disbelief written on his face. But you're still a weapon, aren't you? The blacksmith nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with the burden of his past. Yes, I suppose I am. Before the boy could respond, a loud hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground. The blacksmith's head snapped up, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. He rushed outside, and there, in the sky, another ship approached. But this one wasn't like the others. It was smaller, more refined, and far more dangerous. The blacksmith recognized the design instantly. This wasn't an alien warship, it was Earth's. The villagers gathered in panic, unsure of what was happening. The blacksmith's face hardened as the ship touched down, its sleek black body gleaming in the dying light. The ramp lowered, and a group of humans emerged, clad in advanced combat armor. At their head was a woman with cold, calculating eyes, her posture rigid with authority. Subject 17, she said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. You've been off the grid for too long. It's time to come home. The blacksmith's hands clenched into fists, his calm exterior cracking. I left that life behind. The woman's expression didn't change. That wasn't your choice to make. You belong to us. The villagers, still confused and frightened, looked to the blacksmith for answers. But this wasn't their fight anymore. This was a battle from a different life, one that had finally caught up to him. I'm not going back, the blacksmith said firmly, his voice steady but filled with tension. The woman's eyes narrowed. You don't have a choice. We made you. We own you. For the first time in years, the blacksmith felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: rage. He had spent so long hiding from what he was, trying to live a peaceful life. But now they had come to take it all away. The life he had built, the people he had protected, they were all at risk now. He turned to face the villagers, who stood frozen, watching the exchange. You should leave, he said quietly, his voice filled with the weight of an inevitable conflict. This is going to get ugly. The woman raised her hand, and the soldiers behind her readied their weapons. The blacksmith knew what was coming, but this time, it wasn't about survival. It was about freedom, his freedom. He had been created as a weapon, trained to fight for others. But now, for the first time, he would fight for himself. The soldiers advanced, their movements precise, their weapons humming with deadly energy. But the blacksmith was faster. He moved like a force of nature, his blade cutting through the air with lethal accuracy. This wasn't like the battles with the aliens. These soldiers knew his tactics, knew how to counter his moves. But they had forgotten one thing: he wasn't just a weapon. He was a man who had chosen to live beyond what they had made him. The fight was brutal, swift, and decisive. The blacksmith cut through the soldiers with a precision that even they hadn't anticipated. The woman, now realizing the full extent of her mistake, stepped back in shock as her forces crumbled before her. You can't escape us, she hissed, her voice trembling with fear and rage. We'll always find you. The blacksmith, standing amidst the fallen soldiers, looked at her with a calm resolve. Maybe. But next time, I'll be ready. The woman retreated to her ship, her gaze locked with the blacksmith's as the ramp closed behind her. The ship lifted off, disappearing into the sky just as quickly as it had come. The villagers, stunned by what they had just witnessed, didn't know what to say. The blacksmith, covered in the dust of battle, turned back to his forge, but this time he knew the peace he had once sought was gone. His past had caught up to him, and there would be no running from it. But as he looked at the faces of the villagers, he realized something else. He wasn't alone anymore. They had seen what he was, and though they feared him, they also respected him. He had protected them, not just from the aliens but from the ghosts of his own past. For now, the battle was over. But the war was far from finished.